Oh, I'm sorry, did I take your last one?
It's possible. Yes,
I have,
yeah, let's do that.
so just pop me out after whatever one is over there.
I will be at it first.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for being right early once again. That is most of us. We have one of our speakers who is caught in traffic, so he's not bright and early. But we're going to change the agenda slightly. But it was a wonderful day yesterday. Thank you all for being so involved. And I do want to say that once again, remind everybody, and I want to remind myself that we are live from Pentagon City. And it is, what, Wednesday morning, live from Pentagon City. PostalVision 2020. A number of things we've done that are different this year, and one is that we are streaming. And that worked well yesterday. We had a few hundred people coming in. We don't know exactly where they're coming from, but good morning, everybody in the world. Those of you who are probably Europeans who are later in the day and are here with us. So thank you. And that gives us and expands this entire story. Too bad they couldn't be involved in the work groups, which were very active, but we'll begin to share some of that things, some of those findings. So what we'll do, in fact, right now, and we'll postpone the cross-border discussion a little bit, and we'll take a look at the results that came through. Now, I warn you that this will be pretty busy. These have not been filtered, but these are the actual responses that came from your work groups. And we'll take a little time and look through them. And then I want you to know that, and look for some impressions that we want to comment on this morning, if you would like. And then we do want you to know that we're going to filter these and keep it alive, and we'll talk about at the end of the day or the end of the morning where we're going to go with all this. But let's take a look at the first slide from coming from yesterday. And by the way, let me say that you all were really engaged. This was an experiment. We weren't sure how it would be received, and as you know, those of you who participated, it seemed like just about everybody were quite engaged, and we look forward to doing this more if that's what you'd like to do. But let's first of all take a look at the first group full conference slide in terms of who's the primary stakeholder. We have that, Mark, Brian? There we go. Sender receiver. I don't know if that surprises anybody, but interesting question. That of course could be interpreted now. It could be interpreted in the future. It could be interpreted as global. It could be interpreted as U.S. It's probably a U.S. perspective, and I think it may have been influenced somewhat by the comments we heard earlier about where the business is probably going, meaning towards the consumer. There's more consumer power, and maybe this is very good that we ought to be thinking about that. Clearly, in terms of payments, it's out of whack. The sender is paying the bill for probably 99% of our traffic, and yet we feel that the primary stakeholder here is the receiver by 56 to 44%. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, I'm going to go with one. All right. There we go. This is an interesting one. Asset reliability on big data. We didn't spend a lot of time on big data this year, but we certainly are impressed. Jim Cochran told us about how much data they've got, and I think this says that we might be wanting to do more with that big data if we can. There's a liability there, as we know. I think this is where this comes in is in privacy. But I think that there's obviously, this is convincing that there's more opportunity here than risk. These were the questions that we asked of each table, as you recall, and I won't read them all. You've been through them, but we are going to go right into some results. Wow, this is a busy one for me to even see and read from here. But let's just take a couple minutes to look at these. These are the actual responses that came from each of the facilitators. That's a little better. Yeah. It would be pretty silly, I think, to try to read through all these at this point, and I'm sorry that we haven't filtered them, which takes some qualitative analysis, and we weren't really up to that last night, but we will. Anything stand out to anybody here? Is it surprising? Looks like people are looking and reading. I see one right in the middle. Maybe it's because it's a short word, greater need for partnership. I'm happy to see that. I'm a proponent of that. And it certainly goes to our theme about collaboration and need for value chain collaboration. Any surprises in here for any of us? Still looking it over? Okay. Well, then I'll just actually pass through it and into the next one. This is table 1 through 5. Red, how the transformation from push to pull change the postal business model. We will attempt to interpret this, and we will we'll talk about later what we're going to do with this and where we go with it. The second question, a little time to look at this. How do the needs of the mail paying customers differ from shipping paying customers? Knowing that we are in a business that is primarily still paid for by the the mail business, and by the way, it is in the U.S. about 80% of the revenue is coming from mail. Europe is about half, from what we understand. And in that case, I can observe, at least in some conversation, that in the case of mail, it's obviously all paid for by the mailing shipper or the mailer, the sender, and in the shipping situation, it's paid for indirectly, at least, by the consumer. If the consumer gains more power, what does that mean? Is there going to be a shift in terms of who pays? I'm not sure that comes out in these bullets, but it's a question that I have. We'll look at the next one. How can a postal platform support the concept of coopetition? I think that's an interesting question, and particularly in the U.S., again, we're, I think, fairly unique in our form of privatization, which is quite substantial in the way of work sharing, and yet in the parcel business, where we're seeing the rapid growth, a lot of that growth is frankly coming from the competition, which obviously puts us in a situation of coopetition. So that's, I think, I'm going to look forward to try to decipher this and see if there's anything. Any comments on this question? Let's move to the next, which is how can Post move from a cost-based business model to a value-based business model? I heard some interesting conversation about that last night, and that's a real challenge. Again, if the business is primarily about postage per piece in mail, and that's how, at least in the U.S., we're structured, how do we get to a different model whereby we can really appreciate the value of what's happening in the transaction as opposed to the actual cost of moving a piece of mail? And so that's, let's see, that was the first section. In the afternoon, we asked this question of everyone: can Post continue to profitably provide mail and shipping services? I think that's quite predominantly yes answer, 83 to 17, and I think most of us are happy to hear that. In terms of mix, this was an interesting one as well. Some people asked ahead of time, we should have said, well, where are we? Well, we are in the U.S. Ahead of time, 80-20. The revenue is really, in the mail business, still absolutely driving and keeping this, it is responsible for this nearly $70 billion in revenue. But with the movement towards parcel growth, what is the feeling, and I think this is a gut feeling or a sense, that it's going to move more towards parcels. And interestingly, we see a 40-60 by 2020, which is only 5 years away. And clearly, even some believe it could move as quickly as 20 to 80. That would be a dramatic swing. But it's interesting that, and then I would propose a question as we go from here is, well, how do we pay for that? If it really does go to 40-60, first-class mail, which of course is the dominant part of that, the mail side, is 3 times the margin of parcels. Parcels is, by definition, a competitive product. There are some really strong competitors out there. As we know from what we talked about yesterday, Amazon and others are driving the cost of delivery down. And that's not a very high margin business long term. So if we do that, how do we make money if 60% is coming from parcels? That's going to be interesting. This was not a margin question, it's a revenue question. So in the deeper questions, the deeper dive, the 4 sections, we asked about how can Post remain viable based on based on those other responses. To be honest with you, I can't see it. and hopefully you can see a little better than I can. I mean, I can just about.
So just give you a second to look through those. And of course, we will share this with everybody. We'll put it up on our website, and we'll talk about what we do with it beyond that later on. Next question was what could or should, you could answer it either way, I suppose, be the role of the post in e-commerce logistics world shaped by Amazon and Alibaba. And of course, this does suggest that Amazon and Alibaba are shaping this e-commerce world. And I don't think there's a lot of argument about that. We haven't felt a lot of that about Alibaba in this country yet, but I think there's a feeling that with that cash hoard and what they've achieved in China, that it's coming our way. So the influence is something we're really going to need to respond to. And then we asked what innovations would allow the Post to ride the wave of e-commerce delivery growth. Interesting that there are fewer points here. I'm not sure what that represents, what that suggests. Maybe we don't have enough ideas, or maybe they're just all very good and focused. Again, the shortest one there is postal library, so I can see that. We talked a lot about that, and I think that it does indicate that that's an opportunity in our country. Again, learning from what's been working in others.
I want the virtual address.
Virtual address, okay. Oh, there it is.
I want more than one X.
Behind the armchair. Okay, Joe, you can pitch for that. Is Gray Hair Advisors software working on that? Okay. Thanks for that one. And then even fewer here. How can Post participate in a bi-directional cross-border e-commerce flows? Not surprised because we haven't talked about cross-border yet. And ideally, we would have asked that question after this morning's session. But the thinking behind this one is that we tend to think of the Postal Service services, at least in this country, again, as primarily an export provider. But frankly, there's an enormous amount of traffic and revenue coming from import, particularly from China, as we know. And there's a little bit of controversy, as they would say in England, about that. And we're going to be talking about that imbalance of traffic based on things like terminal dues and customs issues. So that's it for our sessions. I won't really ask for how you enjoyed it or liked it because it seemed like everybody really participated. We really appreciate that. We will interpret these data and turn them into some sort of data form. You'll see them at PostalVision2020.com, and obviously we have everybody's email, so we're going to be in touch with you. And those of you who are not with us here and are streaming, please come to PostalVision2020.com and get on board. And I'm also advised to suggest that those of you who are streaming, please use Google Plus to sign in. Or is it Google Plus? Yes, which gets you into Google Circles, I believe, and then to Google Hangout. And we want you to be an online piece of a member of this community, and to get into that. Thinking of Marshall's from yesterday, we like the idea of feedback loop. All this communication hopefully will be bi-directional. So thank you. With that, we still don't have Mr. Campbell. All right, we're going to go ahead anyhow. I'm going to introduce Mike Comstock. You, I think, all know Mike. Mike and I actually co-founded Ursa Major Associates in 2000 or 2001. So we're about 15 years into it. And we do strategy consulting and have worked for a lot of you all in the space. And Mike in particular, having had spent some 20 plus years at DHL Express, where we met some 30 plus years ago. I was there as well. Has been spent most of his career in the cross-border area. And in recent years, Mike has been very involved with DHL and Global Mail, who is now called DHL e-commerce. Has been with Pitney Bowes and ClearPath in terms of providing consulting services, and also with Borderlands, who's one of the cross-border players. So Mike is my colleague and co-founder of Ursa Major Associates. He's quite the expert in this area, and obviously have invited him to lead this conversation. He'll do the rest of the introductions. Thank you. Mike Comstock.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the introduction. What I'd like to do first is go ahead and call out the panel that we have here. We're actually breaking this into a couple of sections. We're going to talk about some of the major issues having to do with customs and what is known as terminal dues. And unfortunately, Jim Campbell isn't yet here, but he is on his way. Got caught in traffic. It sounds like a logistics problem to me. These things happen. So I'm going to ask the rest of the crew, Ty Bordner from Amber Road, Tom, come on up. Shay, Felix, and Brian, want to come up? Brian Viron, and Joe, come on up, please. Thank you. So let me introduce, first of all, we have here Ty Bordner, who is Vice President of Product Management and Solution Consulting with Amber Road. Amber Road is a global trade management company. We have Brian Viron, who is the Executive Director of eBay's Policy Lab. We have Joe Murphy, who is the Chief of International Postal Policy for the U.S. Department of State. We have Tom Forbes, who's the VP of International for MetaPack. And we have Shay Felix, who is the Global Product Marketing Manager for Indicia. And all these guys are experts in their respective areas relating to cross-border trade. So I think that you'll enjoy what they have to say, and I know just looking at some of their presentations, I'm sure you will be learning a good deal as well. As I mentioned, Jim is stuck in traffic at the moment, but we're going to start with Joe talking about customs, and then we'll move into some of the solutions that are in the marketplace with Ty, Tom, and Shay. We've asked Brian to join us here on the stage, and Brian, with his role at eBay, we sort of see him as a customer advocate and someone who is deeply involved in these issues to facilitate trade on a global basis. When we talk about cross-border e-commerce, we really have a much more complex value chain than what we're all used to in our own domestic markets with online purchasing and e-commerce. We're not going to attempt to address the entire value chain here, but really focus on the links that are colored green on the slide. And this is basically the transportation logistics links in the cross-border value chain, having to do with customs, having to do with classification, delivery, and so on. So, admittedly, when we looked at how to address these areas, focusing on the transportation logistics makes sense because this is primarily a postal-related conference, and that has to do with delivery. There's certainly other aspects, such as payment, web localization. All these things are very, very important in a successful cross-border transaction, but we're going to focus on the transportation logistics. So with that, we will just move directly to Joe, and Joe's going to talk to us about. Did I customs treatment of cross-border parcels and what's going on in the postal world and the UPU. Yep.
Good morning. I was thinking about our start yesterday and the comment that you know, as American, we start at 8 o'clock. It's a little rough. So anyway, as was explained, I'm Joe Murphy. I'm from the U.S. Department of State. One of the idiosyncrasies of the Department of State is in our bureaucratic culture, we don't do PowerPoint, so I'm sorry, you're just going to have to listen. But I'll try to make it painless. We do email sometime. I was very pleased to have been able to be in the audience yesterday and listen to the speakers, particularly yesterday morning, and reflecting on what I heard. I last night revised my remarks a little bit to try to tie them in a little more closely to yesterday's discussion. And so I'll start out by recalling something that Mr. Kleva outlined for us yesterday, that over the past several years, the UPU has moved to address issues arising from the increasing prominence of packages and small packets in the mail stream and the emergence of e-commerce as a driver of this trend. The UPU's efforts come against the backdrop of many posts working to adapt their business model toward a greater emphasis on commercial package services. In this context, customs procedures for international mail have taken on an increased direct importance to posts. They also have implications for private sector actors competing in the commercial market for delivery services. I'd like to note at the outset that in our discussions here, in conversations elsewhere about the use of mail for the exchange of goods, and more broadly in any discussion of trade, there's a tendency to talk about customs as a barrier to be overcome. While that perspective is natural from the vantage point of commercial interests and from the vantage point of postal operators concerned with being conduits for commercial goods, it's worth keeping in mind that customs regimes fundamentally enable trade by allowing the movement of goods across the boundaries of sovereign states. In our rapidly globalizing world, we take this enabling function for granted. We tend to focus on the gaps between our expectations of customs processing and its reality. These gaps concern both commercial actors and governments for a variety of reasons that include adequacy, timeliness, and fairness. And the stark reality is that most customs authorities around the world are struggling. They're struggling to manage the volume of global trade moving through commercial channels. This reality affects traditional modes of conveying trade goods as much or more than it impacts posts. I was asked to comment on the customs issue as it relates to mail by providing real-world examples of concerns, explaining why these concerns exist, and identifying potential means of addressing them. I'll deal with examples of concerns and a discussion of why they exist together in one discussion. The high volume of heterogeneous shipments that e-commerce entails and the importance of speed to this business pose special challenges, which correspond closely to the challenges historically faced by the express delivery industry. Express delivery companies have worked proactively with customs authorities around the world to design solutions to the particular challenges of their industry, often securing and paying for dedicated customs facilities and personnel, and collaborating with customs personnel to build systems for the collection and sharing of advanced electronic information for risk analysis. This collaboration met the needs of the express delivery industry and of governments. While it's imposed significant costs on the industry, it's also allowed it to thrive. Postal operators, in contrast, were historically in the communications business, and the traditional customs treatment of mail, in particular letter mail, reflected this understanding. As the international mail stream has transitioned from the conveyance of documents to the conveyance of goods in trade, differences in the way that mail and commercial shipments are treated by customs authorities have come under greater scrutiny. Two issues in particular stand out, and I've alluded to them. The provision of customs personnel and equipment to postal exchange offices at no cost, while express delivery companies and other shippers must pay for similar services in many settings. And the lack of advanced electronic information or advanced electronic data, as is called, on most mail items, which can hamper customs processing. I'd like to point out that this cuts both ways, that the express industry wanted to be able to have this data and provide it to speed the processing of its items through customs, because that was essential to their business model. And the inability of posts in most instances to provide this data impedes efficient customs processing and hampers their delivery effectively in the express market or in the e-commerce market outside of specific express mail chains. To the extent that express delivery companies and posts are in competition to provide similar services, these differences and others can be seen as conferring competitive advantages on posts. I should mention, however, that the question of whether express delivery companies and posts are in fact providing similar services is contested, primarily because of differences in the characteristics of two streams of items they deliver. These differences include the ability of express shipment companies to choose and know their customers, their end-to-end control of shipments, and the greater concentration of bulk and high-value shipments in the express delivery system. Nevertheless, the greater the convergence of the characteristics of the two streams, the stronger the case for comparable treatment. This isn't just a question of static analysis, but also a judgment about trends and aspirations. It is now widely accepted that, as the volume of documents in the mail is declining, many designated operators have placed a greater emphasis on package services, especially services for the rapidly growing e-commerce market. It is now also common to observe that the ability of posts to service this market is essential for the future of the postal sector. Yesterday, we heard Mr. Clavau tell us that about the UPU's aspiration to provide a single territory for the reciprocal exchange of e-commerce. If this aspiration is to be realized, UPU members will have to reckon with the implications of that transformation from the standpoint of its effects on competition and its impact on efficient customs operations. To begin with, I'd like to recall something else that Mr. Clavau told us. Pascal, I'm sorry to pick on you so mercilessly. I'm sure you'll have something to say. The UPU has worked very hard over a number of years to establish a framework and to build the capacity for the exchange of advanced electronic data. I don't want to discount these efforts. It's a significant undertaking. The United States is pleased to have contributed to these efforts through sponsorship of Congress proposals, leadership of the UPU Postal Security Group, and support for the work of the International Bureau of Security Measures. Additional efforts will be required, however, to accelerate Post's participation in advanced electronic data exchange. This was strikingly apparent to me in our discussions in the fall session of the UPU Council of Administration, where it was clear that some governments strongly oppose efforts to require the exchange, to require the provision of this data, despite the security imperative and operational advantages it offers. Beyond efforts to advance the UPU's ongoing work on advanced electronic data, which was motivated chiefly by security concerns, it's also time to directly address issues of competition. As Jim will tell you in his presentation, the Department of State has a legislatively mandated advisory committee on international postal and delivery services, of which I'm happy to serve as the executive director. For the past 6 months or so, our committee has carefully considered customs treatment of mail. Our starting point was a series of detailed proposals offered by members of the committee representing parts of the express delivery industry, and these proposals were first presented by Mr. King. Detailed discussion of these proposals and the issues that motivated them by the whole committee and subsequently by a specially constituted subcommittee, yielded agreement on the need to establish a UPU principle on non-discrimination in customs treatment of mail and similar shipments. At its the recent meeting on February 6th, the iPods Committee, that's their acronym for the International Postal and Delivery Services Committee, formally adopted a recommendation to the State Department that the United States propose an amendment to the UPU Convention incorporating such a principle. Subsequent internal consultations within the U.S. government resulted in interagency endorsement of the iPod's recommendation, with only a slight modification to the specific language it had proposed. Committee members' expectation is that this will be offered by the United States at the next meeting of the Postal Operations Council of the UPU in Bern in April. Specifically, the convention article would provide that member countries shall ensure that customs and other laws and procedures related to import and export, including those related to customs clearance, are applied in a non-discriminatory manner to similar items, whether conveyed by designated operators or non-designated operators, so as not to create an undue or unreasonable preference or competitive advantage for any operator or class of operators. In implementing this provision, member countries may, in compliance with national laws, take into account similarities and differences in customer characteristics, shipment characteristics, capabilities of operators and customs authorities, and operational differences. I want to be clear that non-discriminatory treatment does not mean identical treatment, and it is reasonable to expect that member countries in compliance with their national laws will take into account, among other things, the similarities and differences characterized in the amendment, namely customer characteristics, shipment characteristics, and capabilities of operators and customs authorities, as well as operational differences. While this provision would still allow individual countries considerable scope to apply the convention in ways that conform to their specific circumstances, in my view, its inclusion in the UPU Convention would signal UPU members' commitment to fostering the unfettered growth of e-commerce in a manner that avoids conferring undue or unreasonable preferences or competitive advantages on postal operators. Ultimately, such commitment would greatly increase the prospect for extending the principle of unified postal territory, the foundation principle of UPU, into a future that embraces continued e-commerce growth in mail volume. On the other hand, failure to build on a foundation of such a commitment could imperil that enterprise. Thank you.
That was good. I appreciate the insight of what's going on at UPU. Anybody have any questions that you can direct to anything on custom? The one thing that comes to mind, Joe, is that so much has been focused on sort of packages being shipped, outbound packages from one country to the next. And as we all know, in e-commerce, we had a very high rate of return shipments. And return shipments can really be a problem when it comes to moving out of a country of destination back to the origin. And thanks, Jeff. That's better. There's a lot of issues having to do with that. Is that part of the discussion that's going on at UPU to date in terms of how to handle returns, things like duty drawback, VAT reclamation, and so on and so forth?
I believe that there is a widespread understanding on the part of everyone that engages in this business, and certainly among participants in discussions at the UPU, that returns are sort of one of the principal requirements for posts to really dive into this e-commerce business. And managing returns and rebates and customs duties has been a particular sticking point. The hope, I think, is that there can be an evolution toward a seamless interface with customs in these kinds of commercial transactions that would allow for that trade to flourish, but the exact way forward is still somewhat cloudy. It involves really decisions beyond the capacity of the UPU, that they are fundamentally customs issues, so it will necessitate interaction with the World Customs Organization and national customs authorities. That is a dialogue with the UPU itself and the countries engaged.
John?
Well, as usual, I have a question. I'm sorry. And I happen to be on the iPods committee, as is Bob Reesner and others here perhaps. So I am somewhat embroiled in some of this, but I think it's worth surfacing the question, and this is partly to Brian Biron as well, because it comes up in the eBay community very much, that there is a disparity between what eBay sellers in this country might have to pay to have a shipment delivered from here to California or from here to Connecticut, as opposed to what eBay sellers in China may pay to have that same shipment, same item delivered to Connecticut. And in the eBay world, they're all eBay sellers. So I know, Brian, this was surfaced, in fact, in a Washington Post article that a lot of people may have read not too long ago. And Joe, you certainly know what I'm talking about. Would you care to just share that just, I know you can't give it necessarily an opinion about it, but help us understand what that disparity is and why, and I'm curious to know, Brian, whether you have any comments on that as well.
I think it would be easier to talk about that issue if we had the benefit of the terminal news presentation. But the short answer, I think, is that depending on the characteristics of the specific shipment, much of the disparity in price is going to be the result either of the operation of the terminal news system or the operation of a bilateral negotiated agreement between, in this case, the United States and China. And that's going to depend on the characteristics of the shipment, whether it's a terminal news issue or a bilateral agreement issue. But I know that I used Pascal's name in vain a few times in my presentation, and the question about the returns and customs issues involved in returns is an area where he really is much better qualified to comment than I am. So if I could ask Pascal to address that issue.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I don't want to anticipate any debate we will have in April and after that also in the Congress, because of course, as a Deputy Secretary General of this organization, I have to respect the principle of subsidiarity of states, and it's of course our aspiration at the UPU to make sure that at the end of the day we can cope with this environment and this all e-commerce stories. The item is complex, like we will anticipate also this terminal use discussion. Since 69 we have this discussion, so it's not new. Every time it's coming more and more interesting, because of course you have a certain number of phenomenon that appears in the game. We were talking about, and you were talking about a specific country and problem we do have in specific countries. Here we are, as I told you yesterday, a lot of initiatives going on, especially with WCO, trying to make sure that customs authority can understand also what is going on and what are the problems we are facing. I can also refer to what Ulioni said yesterday, maybe, about what is going on in Switzerland with e-commerce, when you have to transport it costs more to the customer to send an e-commerce item in Switzerland instead of having this be distributed from China. But nevertheless, it is also important to recognize that designated operators that are bound by the treaties have a certain numbers, and you mentioned that compared to express carriers, and so we have we cannot choose our customers. It's important to take consideration of that. And so it will be a complicated debate, but nevertheless a necessary, of course, debate to see how we can have a fair treatment to all players in the game. At the end of the day, we have to make sure that the postal sector can be the partner of this sector, otherwise we will have failed in this mission.
Thank you. Any other questions for Joe like that? Sure.
Is the mic working? Okay. Joe, I thought the presentation was outstanding, and I think you set a framework for how the issues sort of on the ground, the operational issues, are actually tied up in like massive transformational global issues. And that's what makes it so complicated, but at the same time so important. So two of the things that ran through your discussion were the role of money and data. Money on all parts of the system, and then data in particular. You said the other big goal of government besides raising money was to analyze and protect against risk. So my question for you as a representative of the government, as one who sits in the discussions between governments, is there's also a money and data issue at the very highest level of transformation of the economy and the role that the posts and the shipping and the sort of change in trade from being just the purview of giant businesses to actually now a trade regime that has to incorporate the tiniest businesses, and that's where the eBay perspective comes in. The fact that that transformation is critically important from an economic perspective. And so I wonder if you feel like the understanding that the sort of traditional trade regime and the traditional economic model is not driving enough growth in all these countries is apparent at the table when you're talking to government representatives, or are the government representatives still thinking about money and data only in the sort of backwards looking view of, well, we have to have enough money to make sure that we don't have our posts go out of business, and we need to have data because everyone tells us data is important to facilitate our work?
I think in the first instance, when the conversation is taking place in the context of posts, obviously postal revenue is an essential part of that discussion for postal operators who are quite often either heavily subsidized or deep in the red, and see challenges to their traditional business model. But there is also a pretty profound appreciation for the potential that that growth in the sort of e-commerce market has for economic transformation and growth, especially in the developing world, and the role that posts can play in that transformation. So on the money side, yes, I think there is a fairly sophisticated understanding of the issue and the potential, and a willingness to take a broad perspective. And there are a number of issues related to small and medium-sized enterprises and initiatives to try to engage them more effectively. On the data side, there have been high-level discussions about the uses of data to make the sector more dynamic, not just to make posts more efficient. But I think maybe there's less, that conversation may be less advanced.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate the questions and the information that you provided, Joe. It's great. With Joe's presentation as our context, we want to move into talking a little bit about what's happening today in the way of solutions for people who are currently involved in cross-border or contemplating becoming involved in cross-border e-commerce. Clearly, the value chain still has a lot of friction in it, and UPU and WCO and other entities are attempting to streamline and remove that friction. But in the meantime, we have a number of companies that are involved in delivering solutions today and helping their customers deal with the friction that is inherent in cross-border. So with that, I'd like to have Ty talk to you a little bit about what's going on with Amber Road.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. Good for folks. Some of you may know who Amber Road is, and some may not. So just a brief introduction of what Amber Road is all about. You know, the area that we're a software company. We've really focused on what's called GTM. Global Trade Management is the name that the analysts and gardeners of the world have given it. And in a nutshell, what we focus on is managing, measuring, optimizing, automating the information that represents cross-border moves anywhere in the world. Big task. By no means do we have every piece of the puzzle solved, but that is our mission. And largely, you know, in our existence, we've been working with a lot of the very large manufacturers, retailers, to help them move their goods across the world. But frankly, the last 2 to 3 years, we've been highly involved with postal organizations, parcel, e-commerce, movement of goods. So it's very exciting for us to be able to see that our solution capabilities can be leveraged, in that world as well. Yesterday, maybe another way to describe what we do is yesterday John Hagel's presentation talked about platforms, right? Platforms and largely platforms can help remove barriers, and that's how we think of ourselves, right? We are a global trade management platform, and one of the things that platform does is helps take away or solve the barriers that are inherent in global trade. Do I advance the slides? This?
Green arrow.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, I think hopefully this presentation really dovetails well with Joe's presentation. I'm going to talk about one specific aspect, or maybe one barrier to global trade, where I guess the quote commercial world and the postal or e-commerce world are sort of coming together, and that's classification. So again, I understand people in the audience may have different knowledge of what classification is. This is specifically the harmonized system. It's an international nomenclature that classifies products, right? It allows countries to classify traded goods on a common basis for customs purposes. At the international level, it's a 6-digit number. I'm going to show you the next slide, sort of what that looks like. And it comprises 5,300 product areas that appear as headings, subheadings, and arranged in 99 chapters. So this is what a harmonized number looks like. This happens to be, one of the very first ones, which starts with live animals. This is horses. So it's a 2-digit chapter, 2-digit heading, a subheading, and then the last 4 digits, when I say 4, it could be anywhere from 2 to 6 or 7, depending on the country, is for country-specific purposes, for statistical breakout, perhaps even some regulations and or duties that are tied to those country-specific digits. Again, beyond the 6. So the word harmonized is a bit of an oxymoron. It's 6 digits harmonized, beyond 6, it's really not harmonized. So why? Why classification? Okay, so as I said, it's the HS numbers used to normalize all products under a single nomenclature. It was really designed, built by the WCO around 1980, and it really was for the purposes of, managing trade, countries that, are levying duties on other countries. There needed to be a common way that we talk about products, classify products, right? So if people are putting a duty on bananas, another country might want to counter that. They have a facility and statistics and data that represents that. So, but it provides the statistics for the export and importation of products in a common, normalized way. It associates the duties, taxes, and other fees against those products as customs collects, revenue. And it also allows for the tying of regulations, cross-border export-import regulations to specific products. Certain products have more regulations than others. Food, drugs, things that could be used for dual use, whether they're used for their intended purpose or could be used for nefarious purposes. So trends and requirements in the postal world relative to classification ultimately, but some certain things. So one of the things that is happening, not just postal world, but the e-commerce world, if you will, and that is customers, consumers ultimately they want delivery duty paid. So that's an Incoterm that means when you receive your goods, you don't owe any burden on duties. It's already baked in to the cost of the goods, right? I don't want to have something come to my door. If I'm in China and I order an iPhone from the US and I get that iPhone, I don't want to have another fee for paying for the duties, taxes, and fees. I want it to be all baked in. Governments want to collect the correct duty, tax, and revenue, right? They one of the responsibilities is to do that for their local governments. And then also governments need to enforce, as Joe talked about, some of this data that's flowing to enforce security regulations, to analyze what's moving, to have, and what's happening is, the world customs organizations are all really kind of started with the US, but it's permeated through Europe, China, and the rest of the world, want to get information before the shipment arrives, right? So that the analysis can be done. And if there is a potential security risk, that good may not actually leave the outbound port. So there's an article about 3 weeks ago in the Daily Mail, and I'm not going to read all these pieces to you, but it just really is pertinent to this discussion, right? There was an article in Daily Mail that talked about how criminals are beating the border control, customs system, regulations, security, even duties, taxes, and fees by using the postal service, right? And the way that enables them to do that is because the postal service in the UK here didn't require a harmonized number, right? So the ability to understand what the regulations are for a particular good is very difficult, right? If the goods are labeled gifts or presents, it's very hard to understand what's in there. If the goods are classified under the harmonized system, we know what's in there, and now the computers can determine what the regulations are and prevent, smuggling. Essentially, smuggling is bringing things in and not paying the correct duties, or from a security standpoint, not allowing things to happen. One of the things that was going on here is people were taking a gun apart, shipping parts of the gun through the postal system, and maybe the description was, metal. Right? And obviously people could reconstruct the gun, on the other end. So it was a way to get guns cross borders without circumventing the rules and regulations, and that's a high security risk, obviously. Okay, and then DDP. So as I said, consumers want to know their landed cost, their full landed cost of the international purchase. E-commerce folks, that we've dealt with, one of the big burdens is, Brazil is always a good country to pick on because Brazil typically has a very high level of duties and such. Goods arrive in Brazil, people buy something off a website and they get there, and the cost of the duties may be half or double the cost of the goods themselves. And they go, well, I'm not paying for that. So now you got this returns issue and problem, which is very common again in the e-commerce world. So DDP really solves that. But somebody still has to pay the duties. So the DDP is the exporter, if you will, that's taking on the burden of the duties. They need to have an accurate depiction of what the real duties are in order to make that effective. Businesses want to understand their potential duty liability. Consumers, they don't want those invoices, as I said, at the time or after the delivery of the goods. So effectively, DDP becomes a sales, a customer service, a supply chain finance issue. Okay. So again, challenges for the postal sector around classification. So classification for a large degree in the postal sectors around the world has been ignored. And some of the regulations that have been in place around the postal sector have said there's exemptions, right? Postal movements don't necessarily need classification. The EU is adopting, a position at present that the postal sector will lose some of its preferences around this as it adopts the UCC guidelines. I'll talk a little bit more about the UCC in the next slide. And there's also ongoing discussions right now about this with the EU. There's a lot of dialogue and comments and interaction as to the degree of classification needed, right? It's 6 digits, how many digits of classification are going to be required. So the UCC. So the UCC is the Union Customs Code. It is a recast of what was called the Modernized Customs Code. Many of these provisions and regulations are going into effect that you see here in the fine print January 5th, 2016. There's another date that some things go into effect in May, beginning of May 2016. I guess the point here is that, this sort of, as Joe talked about, the collision of the customs regulations and the UPU regulations, policy standards are coming, sort of meeting here in some way around for my presentation, speaking about classification. So it's a difficult process to get the classification. It's not something necessarily that a layman can do. If you've ever looked at the harmonized tariff schedule, you drill down into it as you get deeper into it, there's very specific attributes about, I see Jody shaking her head, very specific attributes about a product that you need to know, right, which the consumer may not know. So, what are some ways to effectively, solve this, in an economic sense, solve this problem? Many folks create a center of excellence. The integrators, the UPSs and the FedExes of the world and DHLs, create folks that are located, that are experts in this. So when they do get a parcel that doesn't have a harmonized number, they can try to look at the description and make an intelligent decision around what that harmonized number is. So sort of a center of excellence is as highly productive as can be. E-commerce websites, provide, in many cases, not all, but provide product catalogs. So the classification still needs to be done, but once it's up and done, now it can get reused. So the classification, so if a consumer is buying something off of a catalog from a website, as they're buying that, somebody's already done the classification. So then that information can flow through to the transaction, flow through to customs ultimately. And there's another way that is possible, and that is to try to make the classification process easier. So provide a software capability to make it easier. We term that easy classification. So I know this is very fine print, and I'm not sure people are going to be able to read this, but in essence, the goal here would be to take that sort of expert level HS classification process and take layman's terms. So again, I don't think you can see it here, but key in iPhone. And so it's ultimately having a software program mapping the word iPhone to a classification, right? And maybe you can't get to the very, very end classification, but it might prompt the user for a couple simple questions. They can answer that, and now it gets to the classification. So it pushes that burden back to the layman, and it makes it possible for the layman to do this because it's mapping sort of things that they know, i.e. my example, iPhone, into that ultimate harmonized tariff number. Okay, and of course, as I mentioned, what this does, it allows the automated calculation of duties, taxes, and fees. So then this enables a very nice DDP service. So the exporter can be very confident what those ultimate duties will be. They don't have to overestimate and potentially lose business, right? They don't underestimate and lose money. They know exactly what they are. They can bake that into the cost of the goods. There's no surprises for the consumer, and that provides that DDP capability. It's an accurate way for the governments to collect their taxes, right? They want to collect the right amount of tax, duty, fee. So this takes away, once the classification number is there. The Daily Mail article talked about cigarettes. People were bringing in cigarettes without classifying them because they could through the Postal Service. Well, if you have to classify cigarettes, now we'll know what the duties are, right? There's no way that folks can, if you will, smuggle. If again, indeed, that HS number is demanded, right? Which is again what these regulations are. In 2016, this is what's happening. The part of the UCC is to get advanced information about the goods, even for the postal moves, and when that happens, the HS number is going to be part of that regulation, right? So now the ability to smuggle, like I said, goes away, and of course security risk goes away too, because now with the HS number, we know what commodities are being moved, and now the analysis on that data, and again, in terms of the information coming before the goods arrive, the governments can see what's coming and make decisions about what can and can't come or what needs to get inspected. Okay, hopefully that was informative.
Thanks, Todd. Any questions on classification relates to the cross-border? Yes?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. On the classification issue, as you're saying, the layman's approach or
Excuse me,
improving.
just
Yeah.
wait for my.
Oh, sure thing.
We're broadcasting. Did you know that?
Yeah. Thanks for the refresher.
He knows now.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. On the issue of particularly the layman's approach or improving the classification, from your perspective, can the posts do it?
Can the posts, well, yeah, so we've been having discussions with many of the posts. Today we work with USPS, we work with Chronopost in France. We have an agreement, actually, a framework agreement with the IPC so that their member groups can access and leverage our technology. I don't know the answer to that yet. This is kind of new, right? I mean, the postal groups are talking about it. They know they need to do something. It's coming. You know, it's also an enabler for them to do more types of parcel services. I mean, we're going to have to see, right? To be perfectly honest with you, there's a lot of people that think that they can, again, and that is pushing out that burden to the end customer to be able to do that work. So,
Yes, another question, Charlie.
There you go.
Oh, thank you. There's a participant in this entire value chain products movement that not represented here, so I'm going to give them the responsibility. If you make drugs, you submit those drugs to testing and authorization from various regulatory bodies around the world. If you make anything that is going to travel in international trade as part of your manufacturing process, why not make the producer of that item responsible for finding code that needs to travel with that good? Toys in America are submitted to an authority that checks their safety and their suitability for children of every age. And you can't sell that product unless it's undergone that process. Other countries around the world have similar regulatory regimes related to quality and safety. Certainly within that environment, it would be possible to place this responsibility onto manufacturers. It's unfair to give this responsibility to the consumer, to toss them into what everybody acknowledges is an incomprehensible system, incredibly complex to get into and understand. We've had a brilliant presentation of this whole classification system, and some of us are spinning our heads because it's got so many blanks to fill in. Somewhere earlier in the process of creating something that will create wealth around the world, it's probably a fairly easy thing to do for a manufacturer, I should think.
well, I think it's an interesting idea. I think one of the issues is, as I said, the classification for the 6 digits, is harmonized. Beyond that, so the burden on the manufacturer would be they'd have to potentially classify for all countries, which would be a big burden on them. But it's an interesting idea. Yeah, make that mandatory for them to do that work.
So a couple of thoughts on that, Charlie. First off, depending on the industry, they're doing that. In the high-tech industry, for example, major corporations who export their product, the manufacturer does get the equipment or whatever they're selling classified. Secondly, you bring up something very interesting because no one has yet done this, but for nearly all consumer products, you have a UPC code, or in Europe, an EAN code, barcode. Those are unique. And all one would have to do is, at the point of when that was signed, if the manufacturer would have that item classified and connect it to the UPC code, then at any point in the journey, all one would have to do is scan that UPC code, access a database, and get the harmonized number. Now, as Ty correctly points out, it's only going to be the 6 digits. When I'm importing an ocean container full of widgets, I need to go to 12 digits because, or 10 digits, because the rates of duty may change by tenths of a percent or 1%. Big difference if I've got $1 million of product in a container. But when I'm talking about a consumer transaction, the difference oftentimes in the duty rate is rounding error. So if I have one item that's worth $49, what difference does it make if it's 5.2% dutiable or 5.9% dutiable? The answer is it doesn't. Okay. Now, beyond duty, there's also certain other import restrictions. There's all kinds of other things that can come up. But to start with, one of the problems that we've seen in this cross-border world is it's based on the infrastructure for large B2B cross-border transactions, which quite frankly are more complex than they need to be for a consumer shipment.
No, that's a good point. And just to talk about that for a second, in the commercial world, the classification is so important because those fractions of duties that you may be off on, customs can go back, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. So you classified this wrong, you owe these back duties, there's interest, there's penalties, it's a big deal. The parcel world, if you're a consumer and you make a mistake on classification, it's fractional duty. I mean, customs, isn't going to try to collect, pennies, right? So there is an inherent, customs would still say it's a regulation, you got to get it right? But the ultimate repercussion of it isn't quite as large as a commercial. So thanks.
Another question back there? If I'm microphone. Oh yeah, good.
It's working? Yeah. It's Wendy Tan from the UPU. I just wanted to inform that the UPU also has a system, that customs declaration system for its members. It's developed it with the WCO. And we also have a postal electronic guide that has a list of all of the HS codes that have been provided by member countries already for easy access for postal customers to remember. And just one clarification on what Joe Murphy said about the last CA session, where there was a very robust debate about the advanced transmission of data, electronic data for some countries. It's not that they were against, they all recognize the importance of transmitting data. The problem is the capabilities of the countries. You're talking about some developing countries that don't have electricity 24/7. So it's very hard for them to gather this data and then to transmit it in a timely way. So what they were really, what a lot of the debate was about was the transition time for having to provide all this information, and maybe making this mandatory first for industrialized countries or certain lanes, and then extending.
Thank you, Wendy. AJ?
AJ Hernandez from Sky Postal. Further to what Mike was saying, I agree with you. I think HS codes were created for commercial importations. You're sending in an ocean container of high values. I don't think that it should apply, and I wanted to ask on B2C shipments, how much of a movement have you seen towards a simplified import? And I know in my experience in Latin America, there are a lot of countries that have a flat simplified or a simplified tax regime where they speak of categories, for example. Brazil has a flat 60% tax, plus all the other taxes. But that's a way for handling B2C shipments without having to deal with the HS code issue. Have you seen that in other countries?
Well, there certainly are. First of all, there's low value exemptions to a lot of the regulations and the duties, right? So if goods are under a certain value, there's already a facility in place to let those flow easier. Well, it's difficult to answer because like today, a lot of the stuff, if it's postal, there are exemptions from having to do this, so things do flow. But as we said, what's happening is the world, because of the examples I gave for duties and taxes and fees, and e-commerce is getting bigger, right? So I think the customs organizations are like, hey, this is getting more serious in terms of revenue, and of course the risk is there. So I think it's almost trending the other way. It's going from not a lot to building up to where it is becoming maybe going to be more difficult, in this postal parcel world to move goods. So.
Okay, one more question, and we're going to move on. Keith
Gillison, UPS, and it's more of a partial answer as well. To the question asked earlier, can posts comply with the customs? The answer is anybody can comply with it, just no matter how much it costs. You know, the bottom line is we do it, FedEx does it, DHL does it, any kind of private party that wants to invest in the infrastructure to get it done, gets it done. And to his point, we have infrastructure in place where if a piece comes in, it's not documented by Charlie's point, by the shipper, which it should be. That should be the origin for us. But if it doesn't, ultimately, then we have to contact that shipper if we can't diagnose it on the spot and find out from the shipper what the code is and get it properly characterized. We have to incur the cost for doing it. But anybody can do it, whether you do it internally or externally, the systems are there. Yours is one of them, but thousands can do it. So then it matters, the biggest issue is the cost. Now, the second thing on that, though, is that the piece is coming in from China. The Swiss Post pointed out yesterday that it's cheaper to ship from China into Connecticut, as we said earlier, as opposed to Maryland to Connecticut. There are two things that are enabling that. The first is terminal dues. We won't get into that. It's a UPU. It's a very complicated issue. But the second one is part of this customs compliance. There's two factors of that that are making it cheaper. The first is if they're not complying and incurring the costs to comply, then they have an advantage over people that shipped it through bulk or other ways and got it into the country through the proper mechanism. So they're not compliance costs not there with the China Post. And the second one is for applicable items that customs may not be being paid. And if those aren't being paid, then the U.S. government loses out. And then, of course, the U.S. merchant loses out who paid the customs on the goods that they're now reselling. So the customs thing is important. And I think the UP recognizes it as Pascal mentioned yesterday. We're working hard on the CDS. We think it needs to be beyond the CDS, obviously, and include the packets. But anybody can do it. It's just a matter of time, resolution, and unfortunately money.
Agreed. Okay. Good. Thanks very much, Ty. Very enlightening. Next, we want to hear from Tom Forbes, who's VP of International for Metapack. Give us his perspective on cross-border.
Good morning, and thanks very much for the introduction there, Mike. I guess it was last Christmas, meaning just over a year ago, that I decided to Google my great-grandfather to try and find out more about him, because he met a rather grisly end in Honduras. And unbelievably, I got an answer. It wasn't the first time I Googled it. The internet has this habit. It refreshes itself. And what I found was that Google had taken quite a dry academic text and actually put some of the pages onto the internet. And I found out the name of the book, and I ordered the book. The book was shipped from the States. And I have to tell you that the experience was not a good one from a shipping point of view, but I got the answer. Because my presentation today isn't one of genealogy. You can find out the story if you want to talk to me later. You can even find out what happened to the package if you want to talk to me later. What I'd really like to do today is to give three perspectives. One is to try and describe who these customers are who are buying cross-border, rather than to abstract from my own experience. Secondly, to describe how shippers are configuring themselves to ship cross-border. And lastly, to give a commercial perspective on how I and Metapack perceive the Post to be responding to this emerging trend. So to start with some stats, 83% want a clear indication of when items will arrive. 44% are happy with the speed of cross-border delivery. 48% happy with the cost of cross-border delivery. So if we take, my purchase of the book with the answer, I hit the majority. It was a pretty lousy experience. Listening to Ty, I should clearly have ordered a gun or some crystal meth, and it would have got to me a lot quicker. So for the guys at the back of the room, I'll read out some of these percentages. So this is looking at customers in the main importing countries for cross-border. And we see some interesting trends. So we see the UK, Germany, and Australia leading the way in terms of the number of orders per person cross-border. We see some interesting divergence in terms of what customers will accept as a maximum acceptable delivery time. So in the UK and Germany, you're down around 5 days, but if you flip it to the other end of the scale, Russia, 12.4 days is pretty acceptable, Brazil, 9.3. And I think those of you involved in the logistics of cross-border know that those Brazilian and Russian numbers are rarely achieved. Looking at returns, again, quite a disparity. You see that some national characteristics emerging. In Germany, at 13% returned, it's almost a national sport. And again, a high rate of return for the US. And if you look at current patterns and future patterns, I think the thing that really stands out is the countries who are going to be shipping more or attracting more cross-border in the future. So if you take a Brazil and a Russia at 41 and 43% of customers participating in cross-border trade today, they're saying that 84 and 89% of them are going to do that in the future. And the last thing I'd call out on the table is looking at the top 3 origins. The US is clearly one where all of these countries want to buy from. So is China. It's quite a clear conundrum that e-commerce needs to solve. How do you ship from the States and China to the rest of the world? So again, I'll call some of the detail out on this because I'm sure it can't be read at the back. This 4-box grid looks at how delivery options vary by country. So if we take the top left, first of all, you've got Germany, France, and the States, where you've got clearly sophisticated, demanding consumers whose needs are met by the market leaders, typically the posts. You've got a high number of delivery options, the y-axis, and you've got a relatively low amount of carrier competition. So you have dominant post and express in those countries. Then maybe in Canada, a continent-sized country, you have the post dominating, less delivery options, less population. Go across the page to Russia and Brazil, again, continent-sized countries in which new entrants are clearly challenging the posts. I was at a conference in China where a delegate from Russia Post stood up on stage and said, "We've given up on domestic. We want to secure our position in cross-border, recognizing that delivery quality was not what was needed to support e-commerce." And then as you go up to the top right, where you have very high carrier competition and a high number of delivery options, you've got quite fragmented markets in both Australia and the UK. So if those are our customers, how are retailers, how are shippers approaching e-commerce? And I guess this commercial perspective that I'm sharing is rooted in the data that we see at MetaPack. MetaPack is a software company. We, through a single API, allow retailers to connect with multiple carriers, up to 230 carriers now, in fact. And on behalf of those retailers, those shippers, they're moving 400 million parcels through our software every year. And this is what we see in terms of an emerging trend in terms of how they address cross-border e-commerce. First of all, they go to the post. They go to their national post in their origin country, and they start shipping cross-border. They like it. It's easy. Typically, there's no barrier to getting an account. You turn up with the parcels, one integration in terms of compliant labeling, in terms of providing manifest data or customs documentation, and you get access to the world. The second thing that we see on the evolutionary path is, of course, that they then add one of the integrators to the solution. They want that global reach again, but their customers are saying, hey, we want speed, and we want tracking, because not all the postal products come with tracking. Then, as their cross-border e-commerce grows, they start to ask questions. How do I get better rates? Typically, they find their way to a postal wholesaler to buy those same postal products, but at better rates, because they have higher volume. And those rates are typically only available through the postal wholesalers rather than going to the post directly. And then where we see the bulk of the shipments already is with consolidators who are providing a blend of a good rate, close to a postal rate, but with the speed and tracking, speed almost, tracking the same as one of the integrators. So who do I mean by these consolidators? We have some in the room. We have Sky Postal, Direct Link, Ascendia, some emerging from the postal world, some effectively new entrants into the marketplace who are putting together the best of Post and the best of Express with the best of freight forwarding. And then for the global giants, we see some of the very high volume shippers actually started to explore, can I put this supply chain together myself? How much value is added by the consolidator? How much margin is added by the consolidator, and could I do this myself? So we see the SME clustered around the Post and Express. We see the enterprise retailers going all the way through to use of consolidators, and the e-commerce giants flirting with managing their own supply chains. So in terms of the technique, the underlying technique in the supply chain, both the consolidators and the retailers who are doing their own direct injection are rejecting the typical solution where you give to a Post in country A or an integrator in country A, and it's the Post or the same integrator that delivers in country B. What they're actually doing is flipping it on its head, particularly the highest volume retailers. They're saying, okay, what do customers actually want in that destination country? What is specific about them? We heard yesterday the level of adoption of lockers, for example, in countries like France. Okay, French consumers use lockers. How do I make that happen if I'm shipping from the States or if I'm shipping from China, for example? How do I get the services which are relevant to urban dwellers in those markets? How do I cover off people in rural locations, small packets, large packets? So all of the questions that domestic shippers agonize over in terms of making delivery options which are relevant to consumers are now things that the largest retailers who are shipping considerable volumes, and in some cases up to 60% of their volume is now cross-border, they're agonizing over how to get access to those services. They use platforms like Metapack, and we heard from John Hagel that it's basically the emergence of an aggregator platform. We see ourselves as an aggregator platform for posts, carriers, and locker box operators. They're printing the compliant label for the destination at the origin. They're using a consolidator, or they're booking the air freight themselves. They're managing clearance, and at the moment they're finding those postal channels more attractive than express channels for clearance. And then they're injecting into those final mile networks. And that's really the emerging trend that we see. So in terms of the number of retailers using these models, no, they're clustered more towards that left-hand chart that I showed you just a moment ago. But in terms of where the volume is with these direct injection solutions, whether offered from consolidators, whether put together by the retailers themselves. So the last view I'd like to put on the subject is what is Post's response to this emerging cross-border e-commerce world. So as the retailers go through that curve, I see the Posts really splitting into two different types. I see the leaders, and I think they're the leaders, and I call that Deutsche Post, Singapore Post, B Post, Australia Post, and Post NL. You could probably argue that there's 5, maybe even 10 posts that belong in that bubble. I wouldn't argue, but I wouldn't take out the ones that I put in to make space for another one. The reason I call those guys out is because they've created not one, but many interesting and creative private partnerships to allow downstream access to the very best of their services, no matter where they're shipped in the world. And they're working with partners who are solving the other problems in the chain, whether it's how to get enough lift on planes out of China, or whether it's how to clear customs in difficult countries. And then I put the rest, the majority of posts, in a different group, which is not to say that they're not tackling this issue. It's not to say that they're not innovative. What I would say is that e-commerce requires a much greater velocity of innovation. That when I look at Metapack's clients, the shippers, the retailers, they're growing at typically 20 to 25% per annum, with a much higher growth percentage coming from cross-border. They require solutions to their problems super urgently. They've got volume, they need to move it, they need to keep customers happy, and they need to compete in the very, very competitive world of retail. They will not wait for solutions. They will find them themselves. So in terms of wrapping this all up, I guess to throw out a call to action, the first thing I would say is for cross-border trade, Post must develop diverse partnerships, and they must address customers by offering them superior service, and they must do it in a profitable way. It must become self-financing. As I said, the speed of growth in cross-border e-commerce requires a very high velocity of innovation in delivery services. And I think that's a key point in terms of making sure that the best of Post is articulated and available. And the way to do that, I think, is to become accessible to shippers in the origin countries. If you're selling something which is for final mile in the United States or in Russia, you need to articulate this to the retailers in, for example, China or in the UK. Thank you very much indeed.
Good presentation. What I'd like to do right now, for the sake of time, we're going to move on to Shay, and then we can hold questions for those two. And I'm delighted to see that Mr. Campbell has survived his traffic jam and has joined us here. So as soon as we're done with that presentation, Jim will get to you. Anxiously waiting to hear about terminal business. This is Shay Felix from Indicia.
Right, sorry, I'm not Amin. Amin couldn't make it, so I'm a fill-in today for Amin, as you can see on the title. Hi, my name is Shay Felix with Indicia, and I've been asked to talk a little bit today about cross-border business, specifically for small to medium-sized shippers. And just a little bit about Indicia, for those of you that don't know Indicia. We're a software provider that provides labeling, postage, integration services for small businesses. Our primary partner that we use is USPS, and our primary business is in the US. So when I'm talking about cross-border trade, I'm really talking about a very specific audience that originates in the US and is by definition a small business. We do a lot of business with USPS today, and we cater to quite a big segment of these shippers. We have well over 100,000 small businesses that use our software today. And in terms of our influence through USPS, over 20% of all the exports that leave USPS go through our software. So we feel like we have a pretty good footprint on those shippers and their needs, specifically through our software. And we look to speak to those customers through surveys and research, and we even do council meetings across the country where we sit down in groups with our shippers. We try to understand their needs. And today I'm going to give you a perspective strictly from a shipper point of view, not necessarily from a buyer, and how they feel and how they perceive shipping and where their needs are. And as I go through this presentation today, try to tie in those challenges and what we're looking at from our side. So when you think about these small businesses today that want to go ahead and take their business cross-border, it's quite a task for them. They know that cross-border shipments mean more revenue, and they're always looking for more revenue. And they know that these cross-border shipments typically mean more revenue per piece or per good, so they really want to do it, but they understand that it's not as simple as, say, domestic in the US, where price and speed are really the main criteria for logistics, and international opens them up a whole new set of thinking and things that they have to do. And when you really sit down and talk with small businesses, the one thing that's most important to them, even more so than revenue sometimes, is time. Because these are very small companies that don't have the time to deal and learn how to do international business, how to send their goods abroad, how to deal with complicated issues with foreign buyers, how to navigate those barriers. And if they have to deal with that to a certain extent, they'll actually opt out of international shipping, even if they know that there's revenue there for them to get. We've talked to customers that, we brought up Brazil earlier. They were doing 1,200 shipments per month into Brazil over 3 years ago, and they reduced to 400 shipments per month because they just limited the amount of goods going into Brazil because they just felt it was just too difficult for them to deal with the customer service issues. And that's not good for anyone because that business is not moving to another carrier. That business is just moving nowhere. right? That is stopping cross-border trade. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons, specifically around postal cross-border trade. And again, I'm speaking strictly from a U.S. origin perspective. So when you think about the pros that these small businesses see, one is accessibility. And it's not a traditional accessibility in terms of there's a lot of post offices to bring my goods to. It's accessibility in terms of what it means to onboard to become an international shipper. When you look at the requirements for USPS, I know it was talked earlier about, or the lack of requirements, it's pretty easy to do. You know, there's no tariff code required. The forms are pretty easy to fill out. And even a fairly novice shipper can easily onboard and become an international shipper without a whole lot of fuss. So when you think about accessibility, become an international shipper, it's a great onboarding opportunity. And then when you look at the rates, yes, USPS has very good rates on the low weight shipments and also with flat rate shipping for the heavier goods. But also look at affordability in terms of their time to figure out how to offer their postage solutions and combine it together for a shipment for their customers. USPS, at least today, it's still just one country to one country rate, right? There's no zone-based rating domestically in the US and then in the foreign country. It's pretty straightforward. And when you look at the surcharges and fees and things like that that may come through other carriers, it's pretty simple for the small businesses. They can quickly look at what their needs are for shipping, and not only from an onboarding rate perspective, do it pretty easily. And when you look at the tax assessment rates, and we'll talk about the flip side of it, the negatives with that, but a lot of the small businesses quickly understand that they can compete against larger businesses because of the low tax assessment rate for their goods leaving the US and other countries. And they'll see that as an advantage. And they'll actually look at countries where they know the assessment rates are lower than other countries. And they'll use that as a way to really get their products out there and beat the bigger guys. And then in terms of reach, you know, when you're shipping through cross-border trade and it leaves USPS and it goes to another foreign post for delivery on the other end, you're really accessing a very mature network of delivery that can pretty much deliver anywhere in the world and allow them that access and know-how that they can get their goods to their customers. So when you look at the pros, it really speaks to a lot of the pros that are custom tailored for a small business. Now on the cons, there's the flip side of that, right? So for visibility, when you look at the domestic USPS shipping products through Express and Priority Mail, they've gotten tracking to a point that you don't even think about it. It's like a refrigerator. You just expect to come every morning and get your stuff out. You don't think that it won't work. Well, with international, it's not the same way. How Express Mail gets delivered in certain countries will be nothing like what it's like in domestic USPS. And then you have some products which offer no tracking at all, which is a very bad situation for e-commerce. So you have this no tracking capability, and then you have long lead times for delivery, and that creates those customer service issues you see with these small business issues where they don't know how to navigate that. They have no visibility. It's taking long to get there, right? And that kind of leads into reliability. Speed is bad. Reliability issues are worse. It's one thing to say it's going to take 30 days to get there. If you really get down to it, it's even worse to say it's going to be 15 days one day and 40 days the next. That will drive small businesses crazy because they don't know how to deal with that. And those reliability issues aren't necessarily even on the origin post side or the destination post side. We see from our data, again, looking at we do about 20% of all the exports to USPS, we see a lot of those choke points in customs. We're seeing up to 10 days delivery performance issues in customs. We're seeing issues collecting dues and taxes, and then sometimes you get up to 15 days of delay that has nothing to do with the service standards that are posted for these shippers. When they look at the service standards, they see 3 to 5 days for express or 6 to 10 days for priority mail with a bunch of asterisks and legal jargon. But the reality is they don't care about that. They just want to know how long it takes to get there. When you have a 6 to 10 day delivery performance, you have 15 days that has nothing to do with that. That creates a lot of problems for these small businesses. The third point is pricing transparency. We talked about DDP and duties and taxes. Well, yes, there's an advantage for a low tax assessment rate, but increasingly more and more, it's moving more towards a buyer experience, whether it's eBay or Amazon. They're trying to dictate a better buyer experience, and they want that transparency. And these shippers, it's not going to work very well for them in the long run, where they might gain a little bit now on the low assessment rate, but then over time, the complaints and the issues and the returns that happen from not knowing what the dues and taxes are, the surprises at the door, will eventually choke their business. And even if you do get a duty tax calculator and you're able to use that calculator to estimate the goods, without DDP or a confirmation of what those taxes are, you're going to still have surprises at the door. And right now, in the USPS postal network, this does not exist. There are no solutions for our level of customers to satisfy those needs. And last, services. When you look and you talk about service improvements and innovation happening, at least on the USPS side, you see a lot of things from Sunday delivery, you see Metro, you see all these different advancements come in, but you don't see it on the cross-border side. And mostly that's because when you look at the way the UPU designs their products and the way they're used between the posts, they have to dumb it down so that all the posts can figure out how to deliver goods. So you're always going to have the innovation on the domestic level, and that innovation is going to take a long time to get to international, if at all. You may never see some of these things. And the reality is, we'll talk about returns later, there are no returns products available for cross-border for my USPS shippers, just none, right? So they have zero options today. Well, from our standpoint, we're looking at ways to try to help our sellers, help our folks that use our software find different solutions. And so some of these were talked about, Tom, earlier with Metapack, and so there'll be some crossover here, but we see some of the same things. We see that really when you look at the post, the value for the post is going to be the things they do really well, which is domestic acceptance, range transportation, and then acceptance on the other end of delivery. And the piece in between, we're going to look for hybrid solutions that maybe take things from postal to commercial back to postal. Because we feel that we have to somehow navigate that and give our customers what they need so they can do things like DDP and remove those choke points in markets where we know that they're struggling. And then once you do that, you can do things like direct injection, like Tom mentioned. And direct injection is great because now you can access those domestic services that you're seeing Post do on a domestic level. That gives you the type of innovation to do things like delivery choice or other type of functions that give more control and more advantages to the buyer. Because again, that's where things are moving today. It's definitely more buyer focused. And in terms of software providers like myself and even Metapack, you know, we are really strong players in helping the Post bind the network together. We can do things that don't have to be done in bilateral agreements, don't have to take a long time to do. We can use the Post as they're working today, try to create return solutions, or help businesses that do grow up from a medium-sized business into larger businesses learn how to operate their software in multiple countries. Today, if I have a customer, like I'll give you an example, like Foot Locker, right? If I have Foot Locker, which is is using us in the US, and they're on our shipping platform, and they want to open up stores in Canada, do omnichannel, things like that. USPS can't offer a product like that, right? They got to go to Canada Post. That's a whole nother integration for them. That's not what they want. What they want is one integration and one way to use the Post. And so third-party providers can provide that type of access and allow them to use the Post for what they're good at today and allow technology to fill the gaps. Now, one specific example I want to talk through is returns, just to go a little more into detail on how we've created a solution that tries to use the Post for where they're good today. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's no return solution today offered by USPS for our sellers in the US. And Canada, obviously, is by far our largest destination for our exports. So what we did is we just worked with Canada Post, and we learned how to buy postage from Canada Post. And we took their postage, and we called it a returns product. For Canada and USPS, to them, it just looks like an export and terminal dues, and their flows and the way they do business today doesn't change. They didn't have to spend a dime to create a returns product. We were able to create it. And even better, what we did is I removed all the jargon of the Post and how they call their products. You know, the UPU may designate express and parcel and so on, but the Post, they have all different names for their products. If I were to take a US seller and explain to them that, well, you know, USPS calls it priority, but Canada Post calls it express, that's going to get really confusing very fast. So we put generic brand products like Expedited, Standard, Economy off of the postal products. We flip those and we call those return products. It's providing value that does nothing but keep volume within the postal channel and allows them to use them today from a postal transaction. Other things that we're looking at, as I mentioned, some of the choke points. We really want to get to the point that we can allow our customers to not just ship internationally, but do so even without customs forms. To meet the needs that they have today that are even service standards by USPS to get shipments under 10 days as promised. We want to access the local networks in other countries to take products that aren't tracked today and give the visibility that they need, and ultimately allow DDP to flow at a small business level, and it is possible. You know, there's some conversations today about, well, people are doing this today. I think AJ earlier mentioned category-based, right? A lot of these small businesses, they're not going to have the time to invest to harmonize their entire product line, but if you can give them different solutions that break it down into categories and the cost difference is marginal on a piece basis, they will take that benefit and they will stay shippers. And you'll see that earlier shipper I mentioned that dropped out of international shipping, come back to international shipping, and that's good for everyone in the room here. So really, when we think about some of our goals as a software provider, we feel that there's a vibrant service out there of posts that are providing services today. All we want to do is find a way to connect those posts, create solutions that use them where they're strong, and provide those solutions that they can offer today. And we feel like that is possible. And now you can serve and you provide your services to a whole new set of customers that aren't getting today with the very backbone of what's already been provided by the post. Try to get that pretty fast, so. Thank you.
I think what we're going to do here is we'll move along to Jim, and we'll hear about terminal news, and then if we have a little bit of time, we can open it up to questions. We're trying to keep on time today and get our agenda going. So Jim, we're very pleased to see your smiling face this morning, and let us hear about terminal news.
Okay. This is good. What do I do? Put a
Brian, have you queued Jim's
all right, first of all, I do apologize for being so late. The traffic coming in from the north is a matter of suspended animation. It was 2.5 hours for a 30-minute drive. But I'm delighted to be here. My assignment this morning is to give you a simple, short introduction to terminal news, which I will try to do. I think perhaps the best way to give you a sense of terminal news is to explain about the very curious incident that occurred at the Gray Eagle Post Office not so long ago. The Gray Eagle Post Office one Saturday morning had a very unusual queue of customers, each of which wanted to mail a letter in the United States. The first was a local resident, a local lawyer named Fred. And Fred wanted to mail a letter, and he stepped up to the window, and the postmaster said, 49 cents for Fred. Now, this is not too surprising because 49 cents is the stamp price, as we all know. The next person in line was a Belgian, a postal inspector. Sorry, a police inspector. Inspector Ventome, as I'm sure Pascal will recognize. Inspector Ventome, he also wanted to mail a letter. Well, the postmaster looked at a special list that he keeps under the counter. It has you at the top. And he says, 30 cents for the inspector. The next person in line was a Mexican businessman who had some sort of business with the local banks that was not very clear. But the postmaster recognized him as a gentleman from Mexico and says, 26 cents for Senor Vegan. The next person in line was a very tall fellow. He was the coach of a basketball team from Hong Kong that was visiting Gray Eagle. His name was Ping, a very nice fellow. And postmaster looks at his list and says for the big fellow, 15 cents. Finally in line, there was a young lady from Canada. Well, the postmaster looks at his list and he stops and thinks for a moment, leans over and whispers in her ear. The price for the Canadian is, in fact, a secret. What happened next was a riot, as all the local patrons realized that everybody's getting a discount on postage except for the Americans. Now, of course, in reality, this didn't happen. In reality, however, this does illustrate the different charges that the U.S. Postal Service makes for the delivery of inbound mail into the United States from different countries, where the Postal Service is giving very different charges for essentially the same service. So the fundamental question in terminal news is, why doesn't the Postal Service charge the same for delivering foreign letters as it charges for delivering American letters? And the answer is, at least the official answer is, because the Postal Service charges domestic postage for delivering American letters, but it must charge terminal dues for delivering inbound foreign letters because of the Universal Postal Union, the UPU. Now, like a lot of official answers, this isn't much of an answer. So what I'm going to try to do
this morning is just answer 4 questions to try to illuminate this puzzle. First, what are terminal dues? Well, terminal dues are simply the fees that posts pay each other for the local delivery of inbound international letter post. Letter post in the UPU terminology refers not only to letters, but also to what we would call flats or advertising circulars, or even packages up to 4.5 pounds. Just to emphasize, terminal dues cover what we would call last mile services. That is to say, it does not include charges for international transportation or even for transportation within the country. It covers the last mile delivery. If we think in terms of postal service products, terminal dues covers both documents, that is to say, number 10 envelopes and flats, but it also covers fairly substantial packages, up to 4.5 pounds or 2 kilos. Terminal dues applies to most of the Postal Service's products. Exactly how much is a bit of a secret because the Postal Service does not really explain its cost accounts very well for international mail, but it includes outbound first class mail for sure, but it also includes inbound letters and a lot of inbound packages which fit within the small packet category. It includes not only market dominant services, but also competitive services. In particular, ISAL and IPA, International Surface Airlift and International Airmail Priority Airmail, sorry. Just to give you a sense graphically, the solid colors are products which are apparently, not too clear, but apparently affected by terminal dues. So as you can see on the outbound part, about 90% or so of the outbound product is subject to terminal dues, most of which is competitive services. And on the inbound side, it's something over 90%. Most of the inbound products are covered by terminal dues, but they are mostly market dominant products. So how does the UPU set terminal dues? Well, the UPU is an intergovernmental organization founded in 1875 when Ulysses S. Grant was president. It's changed a lot in 140 years in terms of how it operates as an institution. I'll be glad to talk about it, but I don't have time. So the bottom line today is simply that the UPU is dominated. It is largely directed by a committee, a standing committee called the Postal Operations Council. The Postal Operations Council, or POC, is a committee of 40 postal operators which are elected at a Congress. A Congress is a meeting of all the UPU countries, 192 countries. It takes place once every 4 years and makes the most fundamental decisions about the UPU. But the Postal Operations Council is really the center of both legislation. They adopt regulations which are binding on member countries and prepare most of the proposals for Congress. And the POC is the leader of the commercial activity of the UPU. So at least in American terms, this combination of governmental and operational functions creates a kind of inherent conflict of interest. The Postal Operations Council, as I say, 40 post offices, about 20 of the post offices are effectively permanent members. And these are the post offices from the largest countries, as you would expect, but also the post offices that are the most commercial and most competitive. Now, how the UPU sets terminal dues is that the Postal Operations Council conducts negotiations, studies in the years leading up to a Congress, and then they make a proposal to the Congress. Now, as a practical matter, Congress cannot rewrite a complicated terminal dues agreement. Congress is limited to perhaps a few addition of principles or phasing. And in fact, the UPU Congress generally accepts the recommendation of the POC without change. The terminal dues then become effective about 1.5 years later, and they last for 4 years. The current terminal dues system was approved at the UPU Congress held in Doha in 2012 and went into effect on January 1 of 2014. And it includes 3 schedules of terminal dues, that is 3 different rate levels. In general, the rate levels apply depending upon the level of economic development of the origin and destination countries. And roughly speaking, the terminal dues are uniform within each schedule, which means that the terminal dues are not cost-based or domestic postage-based, because, as we all know, the costs and the postage rates vary very substantially among the countries of the world. So this is a picture of what the current system looks like, roughly speaking. The red are the terminal dues for the most industrialized countries with the UPU cost group 1.1. This only applies to the letter post that is sent between the industrialized countries, roughly, let's say, the top 24 industrialized countries. And that's about half of the world's mail at the moment. Another quarter, perhaps, is the mail that is sent between the countries with a middle level of development, Hong Kong, Singapore, countries like that. But also between those countries and the industrialized countries. So, for example, what Singapore sends to the United States is covered by the blue rate, the lower rate. And then the lowest rate is the rate for the really developing countries, approximately another quarter. Likewise, this applies for letter posts sent between the developing countries, but also from the developing countries to the industrialized countries. The developing country group includes such significant countries as China, India, Brazil. This gives you a sense of the different levels of charges that are created by this terminal due system. This is approximate. These are my calculations, but they'll give you a sense of the order of magnitude. These are the charges that an average industrialized country will apply for the delivery of an average inbound kilo of letter post mail. So a mixture of letters, flats, and small packets. In an industrialized country, receiving a kilo of mail from another industrialized country will charge approximately $8.22 for delivery under the terminal due system. That is the red system that we saw in the previous graph. This compares to domestic postage of approximately $15.21. So in other words, each industrialized country post office is giving a sister post office in another industrialized country a discount of about 50%. For letter posts coming from the middle group of countries, the discount is substantially steeper. So that the approximate terminal dues is $6.34, whereas the domestic postage would be much higher, about $22. And the reason for that is that, at least according to my estimates, there's a substantial proportion of small packets coming from this middle group of countries. And then from developing countries, you see, likewise, the industrialized countries are giving a substantial discount on the order of 65% for the mail coming from developing countries. The discounts for small packets, if we created a kilo of only small packets, you would see the discounts are even larger. Small packets are important because small packets are the vehicle for e-commerce. And as various speakers have said, particularly Mr. Kearney, the Swiss Post was mentioning, the growth in small packets from Asia has been phenomenal over the last several years, growing at something on the order of 100 to 200% a year. This is a summary from a report by the Office of Inspector General, in which the OIG calculated that between 2011 and 2012, small packets from China increased 182%. The Postal Service was losing 50 or 60%, and in fact was, in terms of what they would charge Americans, where they were giving a discount of something like 60 or 70% to shippers in China. As the Washington Post said, the Postal Service is losing millions a year to help people buy cheap stuff from China, which is fine for the consumer, but not so good for the local American merchants. The Postal Regulatory Commission asked Copenhagen Economics, which is a economic consulting group in Denmark, to identify the distortions that are created by the terminal due system. And Copenhagen Economics issued their report last September, and this is what it looks like. They found significant distortions in competition, and also distortions in global mail, trade flows, and so forth, and distortions between the industrialized countries. I don't have time to go through this, but the report is on the website of the Postal Regulatory Commission, or I'll be glad to send it to anybody who would like to see it. Okay, what can we do about this? Now, the starting point in terms of the U.S. position at the next UPU Congress must be the U.S. law. In 2006, the Postal Accountability Act significantly changed U.S. law with respect to international shipments and our relations with the UPU. Among other things, Congress decreed a national policy that said the United States government will promote and encourage unrestricted and undistorted competition, and will promote a clear distinction between governmental and operational responsibilities. With respect to prices, terminal dues charges, the PIEA says that the Postal Regulatory Commission is responsible to ensure that terminal dues that affect market-dominant products should be coming to the United States should be consistent with the principles that we apply to market-dominant domestic products. Moreover, there must be no cross-subsidy between market-dominant and competitive products in the international area just as in the domestic area. I think if you do the numbers, you will see that the way we undercharge inbound market-dominant products and then underprice outbound competitive products effectively creates a subsidy between market-dominant products and competitive products. The undue and unreasonable discrimination provision of 40C applies to international, and the antitrust laws apply to agreements related to international products. Finally, the PIEA limits the authority of the of the Secretary of State to agree to any sort of an agreement that would create an undue or unreasonable preference for the Postal Service, or for private carriers, or for anyone else. If we think about economic interest in the United States, this is a study that the UPU did a few years ago. It's the latest and best study, but it's still a bit out of date. As you can see, the international delivery service world is becoming, in fact, a fairly small club dominated by 5 players. FedEx, UPS, the Postal Service, TNT, which is subsequently split into the PostNL and the Express Company, and then the German Post Office, which includes DHL. Those 5 companies have about 3/4 of the business. In the international field, the Americans have basically 3 horses that are running. The Postal Service is an important player, accounting for about 7% of the market. This market is only 2 kilos and under, so 7% of the lightweight documented parcel business. Although the Postal Service is important, FedEx and UPS have about 5 times as much revenue at stake. And that's because FedEx and UPS are competing every country to every country, whereas the Postal Service is primarily in and out of the United States. If you think about what's at stake for the American entities, the Postal Service has about 0.5% of their volume is in international. For UPS and FedEx, it varies between 6 and 15%. The express companies, the private companies have much more at stake in international business. Also affected, of course, are users. Now, the users of the post office, depending on who they are, may be benefiting from the terminal dues situation. Likewise, the users of the private express companies are probably losing. However, I believe, and this is requires more investigation, but I believe that the primary people that are affected as the Asian e-commerce traffic is growing more and more. The primary people who are affected are the American merchants, both the online merchants and simply the local retailers. And that's because of this tendency for low terminal dues to effectively subsidize imports from Asia. The only forum for public discussion of the American policy at the next UPU Congress is an advisory committee to the Department of State. The director of this is Mr. Murphy here, who's already presented, I think. And this is a a committee that is considering what to do about terminal dues as well as what to do about other issues at the UPU. It has a public website, and that's the address. Now, in terms of terminal dues, what has been proposed in this committee was proposed last September by Federal Express, UPS, and me. And essentially what we were suggesting is the United States at the next Congress should advocate a position in which terminal dues between the industrialized countries should be treated in the same way as domestic rates. So they would be subject to the same regulatory restraints from the postal laws, the same antitrust laws. And in fact, we would wind up charging foreigners the same as we charge Americans, with the proviso that the foreigners would still get the same benefit of NSAs and the rest of it as American payers. We would also suggest that there needs to be at some point, there needs to be an application of domestic pricing principles for very large shipments of e-commerce packages. The e-commerce flood is growing every year, and the time period that the next convention will apply is 2018 to 2022. There is simply no way to know how big the e-commerce flood will be, but to continue to subsidize that just seems suicidal. And then finally, we would suggest that the UPU be directed to come up with a real plan for moving away from the current terminal dues system to something that is a more non-discriminatory, country-specific system, but a plan that would also preserve the support for needy developing countries that is currently built into the terminal dues system, providing that in some other manner. The Postal Service has not put forward, so far at least, any sort of analysis of the economic needs of the United States or any analysis of the legal requirements. From what I understand, the Postal Service is nonetheless negotiating rates over at the UPU. How this all comes together in some sort of U.S. position in the next UPU Congress is still to be decided. Thank you very much.
I think everybody will agree that was quite informative, and you did a great job on a very complicated subject. So we are running a little bit late, but I do want to just take a couple of questions. Anybody have any questions for Jim or Shay or Tom? Okay, Tom?
I wanted to ask Jim to make a comment about just a major strategy problem or issue that lies out there ahead, which has to do with defining the difference between focusing on Europe and focusing on the whole world. And in saying that, I don't know whether you've heard Brian Buren say something that earlier today that I think is really an interesting point that comes out of this conference that came up several times yesterday. But the idea that we're in the middle of a profound transformation to a kind of world where one-to-one shipping is perfectly feasible, and where there could be a transformation taking place from a lot of things to one. There have been some questions, Amber Road certainly brought it up, about the posts and whether the posts can play a role in that kind of a world and whether they're ready to play in that world of one-to-one. You would think that they could, but to the extent that things shift over to a larger scale commercial operation, maybe not so much unless capacity is built and unless they get ready. So to Jim's point, just one quick question, and then anybody else that wants to comment on these things that I think Brian sort of triggered a few minutes ago. There came a time where Jim and FedEx and UPS focused on a narrow solution, and then suddenly it became the whole world. And maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit, Jim.
Well, Bob, I'm sorry. The quick question was simplify the question for me.
Yeah, well, I think there's a DHS issue, And I wanted you to just discuss it in any way that's appropriate. If you try to solve terminal dues and customs as a universal issue in which we need to take apart something that's existed since 1875, that's one pathway down the road.
Right.
Another pathway is to focus on the large volume commercial world.
Right.
That, of course, raises the question, are we really touching on the transformation?
Okay, so I'm sorry. The implication of your question, Bob, I agree with. I think the express companies agree with completely. That is that the reasonable way to start this change is to focus on the high volume flows. And that essentially is the movements between the industrialized countries and the very large shipments of e-commerce coming from, in particular, Hong Kong, Singapore, and China. But perhaps you would add some others to that e-commerce list as time goes on. That seems to be the reasonable way to do it in terms of the capabilities of developing countries to deal with a more level playing field, both in terminal dues and customs. I think it's going to take some time for them to get there. And I think that there's some issues about fairness that need to be looked at. But I don't see that that's a reason to not tackle the big industrialized movements today. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Jim?
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. My comment isn't specifically on the question that was posed, but on the presentation.
Sure.
So I can hold.
No, go ahead.
I don't want to cut off the discussion of that very important question.
No, why don't you go ahead with your?
Okay. I just wanted to comment on the presentation generally. I think Jim had mentioned that the issues of terminal dues have been discussed in the advisory committee, in contrast to the customs issue, where the committee made a recommendation to the U.S. government. The U.S. government has deliberated on how to process that recommendation. The terminal dues issue is still under consideration. In the presentation itself, I think that there may be some overstatement of the disparity between costs and payment. That the terminal dues system has evolved rather substantially as a result of decisions that were made in Doha, in particular with regard to the terminal dues rates that apply to China. There are some specific issues in the presentation that probably are worth noting in terms of the scope and coverage of terminal dues. I know that Jim used this visual to demonstrate the physical characteristics of the products that terminal dues cover, but I should note that the express mail envelopes for the U.S. Postal Service that were depicted wouldn't in fact be covered by terminal dues. Express mail is not covered by terminal dues. It's a separate thing. Also, inbound parcel post and outbound priority mail aren't covered. But the main point I wanted to make is that in the terminal dues regime that has now taken effect, China and some other rapidly growing countries pay substantially higher terminal dues, and also the calculation of 2014 domestic rates is being undertaken now by the Universal Postal Union. Those survey results haven't been compiled, but I expect that the gap depicted in Jim's estimate will close somewhat, although it certainly still exists. It doesn't undermine the fundamental point, but just the magnitude. And another point along those lines is the items per kilogram figure that Jim cited. I noticed it's the old figure. There are now more items per kilogram. It's not 10.88, it's 12.23, which will also affect the magnitude of payments. And the details of it aren't important, but the point I want to make is that the system has evolved rather considerably and is continuing to evolve, and the U.S. is working to try to move the UPU membership toward a system of cost coverage to reduce the distortions that have been identified. It's the magnitude of those distortions that is uncertain.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I think it's, we have one more question there, sorry.
It seems to me that something that involves this much complexity and is changing rapidly and is this important, we should be seeing very impressive increases in the quality of the data and the accuracy of the data, transparency, and agility. What kind of grades would you give us for those things?
Sorry, Dave, who are you talking to?
Any member of the panel that would like to take that up?
Quickly, the data with respect to all of the issues that you mentioned here are essentially kept confidential by the Postal Regulatory Commission, so there's no way that anybody outside can judge as far as the U.S. Postal Service is concerned. As far as international commerce generally is concerned, information in and out of the United States. With respect to the Postal Service, all that information is essentially confidential because of the Postal Regulatory Commission doesn't release it. With respect to the information for the world generally, because this is a worldwide convention, that information is even harder to get. But the UPU is making efforts to develop at least reasonable models of what they're doing. The figures that I presented, I will be happy to. They are rough approximations. I will be happy to discuss the details with anybody. But essentially, I'm basing these calculations on UPU data, recent UPU data, including recent UPU statements of postal rates. What I was trying to do was show you the effect of the UPU agreement. And what Joe says about the changes that are made in bilateral agreements, both US, China, but also, for example, agreements in Europe, they will result in different terminal dues, less distortive, but you must understand that those rates are set against the background of the UPU system. So what I was trying to discuss, in very simple terms, Mike, is the effect of the UPU agreement and the implications of the UPU agreement. If we actually get down to the details, it is very complicated.
Thank you, Joe. Good. Brian, one last
Mike,
one.
if I could wrap up with kind of a lightning round question for the three gentlemen, and that would be this. I have a vision that we're engaged in sort of logistical postal shipping trench warfare. Operational changes, 10% of 1% margin increases matter, and that's great. And you guys, your businesses are all sort of identifying ways to improve the system that way. My question would be this. There's also the idea that you could make a major gain. Government could do things to outflank trench warfare. So what would be two ideas that you would throw out that government could do to dramatically change the way the system works, to reduce frictions, not by 1/10 of 1%, but by big margins? Throw two ideas out.
Wow. Big question. I don't know. Yeah. I think it's on.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you for the question. It's a big question. I think that, in Amber Road's world, where we're dealing with what we do, right, which is trying to reduce those barriers, friction. One of the things that's going on in the world today in customs is something called the single window. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but the single window concept is, and this isn't a US thing, this isn't really happening across the world. The US is moving towards it. Matter of fact, there's a mandate to get to it, which is, today the way the world works largely, and the US works this way, is there's 48 different government agencies that have to deal with customs regulations, right, inbound to the US. And your information that you need to supply to them is not through one interface. It's potentially 48 different ways and interfaces to do that, right? So I think my opinion and idea would be to, yeah, keep doing that, right? Provide a single window, which is one sort of, it's a little bit utopian, I think, but over time it can happen, and that is provide one standard global interface to allow the submission of regulatory data that is for inbound purposes.
It's a utopian question.
It is.
One, there's Mike over there saying, oh my God, I let him. Maybe one idea.
So a utopian one, I guess, is to address the issue of flexibility and innovation. And you know, I would question whether privatizing the post could be a way to stimulate that type of progression, particularly if you focus on being best in class at certain aspects of the delivery chain, rather than trying to be good at everything, which I think is really a challenge for all posts. If you try to be good at everything, you end up with a massive fixed cost business, and you're desperate to get the volume in to defray your costs. And I think in today's world where technology can bring together all of the diverse aspects of the supply chain, building huge fixed cost supply chains is the old model.
I think it's, can you hear me? I think it's really just dealing with the friction points. When you look at the innovation, like I mentioned earlier on the domestic side and cross-border trade, it can't start with innovation domestic and then wait for international. It has to have the same type of dedication for cross-border, and specifically when in and out of customs is one that I'd love to see more standardization and across the board for all the posts, so that they have a consistent experience that's not really hidden behind asterisks. I think that is the hardest thing for small businesses to deal with. They want something that's very transparent and not underinflated, I guess, in terms of their delivery form.
Good, thank you very much. Clearly, we've run over a bit. This is a big subject, and we could be here for the entire day and a half on this and not even get as deep as we need to be. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for your contributions.
Before we accept the closing, Brian, I want to go back to you with the big idea you had. I heard you say 2 weeks ago at the IMAC meeting about a big idea, $1,000 global de minimis.
Yes, that would have been my toss out. Would have been $1,000 global de minimis. Right, it's free trade for small business.
And that's, I give you credit for that. Great idea, big idea, simple. That's what I like, simple. And I can't deal with complexities otherwise. But anyhow, got to give you credit for that, big idea. And we need to lobby for that. I don't think anybody would argue with it, right? Except some people who like to maneuver duties and little numbers and figures. All right, go ahead. Close, Mike.
Okay. Again, thank you, gentlemen, for your contributions. And John, we're going to break now?
Yeah, we're going to break. And listen, we ran late, which is wonderful because this was really powerful. Thank you. This was like 2 sessions combined. And let's come back at 10:45. We moved a little bit into really the final closing section, which will pick up some of these ideas too, I think. So see you at 10:45. Thank you. Right. I'll put around.